begin? I mean, it's kind of
Yeah.
time, I guess. It's nice. I'm sure there will be a few more just dripping in as we go. Would you like to start, Thabiso, or should I?
Yeah, I can quickly say something and then we'll get into it. Hi, everyone. Hope are we recording? Yeah. Hope that everyone's keeping well. I know that last time we had load shedding. Hope that everyone's still got power and is writing well as well. So today, basically, we're still going down the line of the writer's calling. Today is going to be very much a craft-orientated, technical aspects of the scene. What makes a scene? What is the story behind the scene? Does it link up to the major story itself, or can it be a story within a story? And we're going to actually present a couple of examples a bit later on. But first of all, Gavin and I are going to have a conversation as to what makes scene an important thing. Why is it a critical building block for a writer? And are we slave to it, or can we invent new aspects to scenes as we go along? So I'm going to let Gavin speak very, I guess, openly as to what he believes scene means.
Okay, so also the reason I wanted to get into scene first is because it's not just the principal building block of the film, but it really is the film itself. If the story of the scene is good, people are interested. And if the stories of the scene don't work, then the film itself will never work, because this film just is a series of stories, which are the scenes. And if you can craft a scene properly, then you really can craft a film properly. It's the essential element of storytelling. And to make an interesting story of a scene can be challenging, but that is essentially the screenwriter's task, is to create one good scene after another good scene after another good scene. And theoretically, a scene must move the story forward. It's not really a story unless the situation of the world changes and the situation of the protagonist changes, whether it's that the obstacles have increased, or that the protagonist has taken a step forward towards its goal, or but something has to have happened, something has to change for it actually to qualify as a scene. And scenes where something doesn't change basically aren't scenes. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can have excerpts, flashes, just beats, a little few visuals that are standalone things, but you can't create a film that way. You need scenes. So getting the scene right and really being able to craft a scene, for me, is like just the principal skill, and it's often absent. It's actually quite hard to write a really good scene and to have the craft to do it, and to do it over and over and over. So it's a place where I'd like to see a lot more writers really giving their energy to. Now, essentially, every scene, like a story, has a protagonist of the scene, and that protagonist wants something, and there's going to be obstacles, and the protagonist is going to have to take action to overcome those obstacles, and then there'll be a resolution, and that resolution should also show character. How a character responds to what they get or don't get, or what happens to them, and the story tells us about them. And a good scene, you really should be revealing character as well. So every time I write a scene, I want to look at what the story of the scene is, and I ask myself these 5 questions basically, which is, whose scene is it? What do they want? What gets in the way of them getting what they want? And what do they do to overcome these obstacles? How does it resolve? And then I guess there's the 6th question of why now? Why are we seeing the scene happen now? Why are they needing to do it now? If there's no reason that they had to be in that scene, then probably it's not going to be a super interesting scene carrying the story forward as a whole. And within the context of that, it's about making it interesting. It's about allowing for interesting characters, interesting obstacles, and interesting responses to that. And the more novel you can be there, but still truthful, the better the stories will be. But that's on the one level, is this kind of the scene as story, and then on the other level, there's kind of this thing where we kind of wondering what to show the audience. Where do we drop them in? Like, what aspects of a world and of the infinite possibilities do we reveal to them, and why? Why do we want to bring them into this moment so that they can see what they want to see, what we want to show them? And is it worth showing them this? This is also where the scene and scene choices are so important. Like, just in terms of that, you are bringing the audience into an experience, and one has to be very mindful about what experience you bring them into and why you are. And with that sort of in mind, one can, one's choices are often determined by the wider story. So a lot of scenes are going to just pop up because you're going to need something that does a certain job. And really keeping that, what is the job of the scene in mind is also very critical. So, the inciting incident, Thabisa is going to show us a inciting incident later and an opening scene, but that inciting incident, which has to happen well. It has to be powerful enough to drive the story, and being able to analyze your scenes in terms of the jobs they're doing is just absolutely one of the critical ways where you can look at that scene and decide if it works or not. If it's not doing the job, it doesn't work. And then there's the second layer, is it doing the job well, and is it telling the story well? And one looks at it in those layers. So later I'll also show you a scene that I wrote to really get into this and explain it nicely. But yeah, I think that's my intro to the scene. Thabisa.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Actually, that's very concise. It actually speaks to a lot of what I wanted to talk to, what I think scene is. I see scene really as being, and this really comes from David Mamet, two people in a room, one of them wants something, the other one wants something, maybe even the same thing, but only one of them can have it. And what's going to happen to that? What is going to happen to that thing? What's going to happen to the other person? How are they going to get it? And then at the end of the scene, well, who does win, or does the thing break? I see it from that perspective. It's very much something that's universal. I think it applies to a lot of different mediums, being, plays, books, etc. But specifically, it's screenplays. Specifically, it's films and TV. It's the bedrock of everything. We call it tension, really. And what everything that Gavin has mentioned right now is building the tension, creating the tension, and maintaining it up until the point of which it has to break or something happens. So I always approach scene from that way. And I think that probably the most significant tool a writer can have in order to create something, in order to create a narrative drive, is to be able to work with that idea of what makes the scene important. Why do I feel something for the characters? Why do I feel there's a tension? Why am I afraid for one of them losing? And that's really the hard part. That's what you got to work at, I think. And I think what I find to be interesting is a lot of films work with only having one major scene that sets the tone for the rest of the film, or everything that builds up to that one scene, or a series of scenes that are incredible. And it's this weird thing that we have in film where the story itself is malleable. But if you're not maintaining the attention of the audience, or rather, if you're not telling a story that can be felt in each and every scene, and the scene drives that story forward, then of course the film starts to fail. And I think everyone here has experienced that. They're watching a film and suddenly something happens, and you're like, wow, that was not part of the film that I was engaging with. That's not something that I thought was going to be the case. But for some reason, the rest of the film works because of that scene. Or the converse, you're watching a film which you think is great, but for some reason, a scene doesn't work and it breaks the entire experience, and you completely disengage with the film. So, as Gavin has mentioned, scenes are the bedrock of what we do, and getting them right is storytelling. If you can imagine that the beginning, the middle, and the end of a film is also the beginning, the middle, the end of a scene. Set up, conflict, and then payoff, right? So those are the technical things that I think we'll be talking further in our examples. But in terms of when did you first figure out what scene is, or what scene was, at least for yourself? Gavin, did you find it like a reckoning that you got hit with when you finally figured out, oh, this is how scenes work? Or was it a gradual process of you crafting different scenes, crafting different takes on what could happen in a scene between two characters, and that instinct was built up thereafter?
It's a good question, and I don't really have, I think, a good answer. In the sense, I think it's more the latter. So, I think intuitively, because we watch scenes, we watch stories, we watch moments. As soon as you start writing, there's some sense of a scene and what it, kind of looks like, but it's not really a developed sense. And learning to craft it is definitely a matter of experience. The amount of times you sit down and do it, and often there's certain scenes that just it's hard to make your own because you've seen them so many times. So much of scenes is telling stories that we've all seen. That moment where two people break up or two people get together, or a moment where someone's confessing. The moments and the types of scenarios are often common, so that when you look at your own scene and you've kind of got one of those, and you can look at it and go, well, this doesn't feel like interesting. And I think when you start, I think that's partly the challenge, is to so many scenes seem flat. So it really, like, for me then, once I kind of really had those questions in mind, the protagonist and the obstacle and the conflict, and just as you're saying, it's set up conflict resolution. It's like telling a joke, and really letting those dictate the scene, how I approach the scene. Learning that aspect of craft really did change the dynamic. And then, as you say, is just practicing. So then it becomes, it's like playing music, that once you learn to improv and you're comfortable with it, can go in so many different places. But until you do, it kind of, you keep tapping the same notes. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me specifically, it sort of came through when I saw The Godfather for the first time. Now, mind you, I've had engaged with older film from since I was a kid. My dad loved, Sergio Leone's films, so Good, Bad, and the Uglies, and so forth. So I was watching these films with him, but I never actually quite understood the construction of the scene until I watched The Godfather, and then I really felt, wow, why am I feeling tension? Why am I feeling this internal pain, or rather, this internal. And that was the I don't know if anyone has seen The Godfather here, but it's the scene where Michael Corleone has to make the decision whether not to shoot Solozzo in the Italian restaurant. And here's a guy we've been following the whole way through, and this is his most critical scene. He has to do something he doesn't want to do, and that's possibly commit murder. And it's the dilemma, the whole thing that plays out. And that's when I really understood, wow, there's this thing that if you set it up right, the characters sort of dictates what happens. There's something that needs to happen, but how they do it, that magic sort of happens in the scene itself. So that's really when I first understood what scene was and how that was actually the foundational bedrock of story. Because that's when it triggered for me. Oh wow, there's a setup. There's definitely a conflict within a character about doing something to get his way, and then there's the payoff. There's the boom. He dies and he walks out. And I think story started clicking for me at that moment when I understood the scene. And I realized that film or a story is really a selection of scenes as you go along in the film. I mean, we understand that film is not a real-time thing. It's something that happens with very selected moments telling an entire story. So once I figured out how a scene works, how a scene worked at least, that's when everything else started working into place. That's when I started understanding dialogue. That's when I understood everything else. And dialogue really was not a slave to the scene, but it was servicing the scene. It was servicing the intention. Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? And really, maybe both of them are protagonists of their own story, and the other one's an antagonist. And what would they say? One person is trying to leave the room. The other person wants to get the number of that person and can't let that person leave the room. What are they going to say? That's the dialogue. And every time I'd watch something that didn't have that as the bedrock, that basis of the scene, I thought it was flat. I thought, wow, I'm not engaging with it because I don't care about the characters. But it was such a very simple thing. And yet we fail at it quite a bit until, of course, you recognize this is something that I have to be throwing at every single scene that I ever write. I don't know if that sort of answers the notion.
Sure. And do you want to maybe then just jump into your scene? I think it's a nice lead in to actually, sharing.
Yeah. So basically, what Gavin and I are going to do right now is present, our own work and just a scene, and just trying to unpack and break what makes a scene happen. So I'm going to present something that's from a feature film that I wrote uh, towards the end of last year and finished the beginning of this year. Something I'm obviously going to be making as a director. So you're going to see a lot of things here that are very idiosyncratic towards a writer director, but I think there are things that are universal across being a screenwriter. So to give you an idea of what this scene is, it's the opening of a film in which a mixed race couple are going to fall apart, all because the guy in the relationship is refusing to accept that, hey, he's actually racist, and that his family hasn't gifted that to him and has cursed him with it. And until he actually acknowledges it, he's going to forever have that as the burden of his relationship, because he's a white Afrikaans guy dating a black Zulu girl. And they could be the perfect relationship. It could be the one thing that is good for both of them. But until he recognizes that there's actually a fundamental part of himself that he's denying, that it's never, then the relationship might never work. So if I open this, and I think it'll be best if I actually read it out, and then I hope everyone is ready to hear it. But I have yeah, good. Everyone's good to hear it. Great. All right. So basically, when it comes to scene setup, of course, comes in from the very beginning, which of course is the scene header, where we are, what time it is, and everything. But if you think about it, right, you can play a lot with scenes just by setting them in the right place, and just by having a scene. If you start the film or you're leading from another scene, if you have a completely different environment, it draws the attention of the audience member. It completely wakens your senses, and now you're engaged with the story again. So I'm going to start off interior bedroom night. Ring, ring, ring. So we know there's definitely the sound of a phone ringing. So it's a dark bedroom, curtains filtering out, an outside blue nightlight. Hold, static silhouette. Ring, ring, ring. Shuffling. And all I'm doing is impressing onto whoever's the audience member that there's sounds. It's dark room, but there's definitely sounds. A hand turns the face down phone right side up. He is illuminated. He answers the phone. Marius. Fuck, man. It's what? A bedside lamp is switched on. The only one on the bedside table of the room. Sorry, my bad. There's a little bit of a typo. The bedroom is plain, nothing hanging on the walls. It's a man's dwelling, or rather, his dominion. Tembi, late 20s, kind-eyed, compassionate, quick-minded, and slow-handed, turns to him from the light. Marius, 30s, solemn, exhausted, determined, is hunched over. He drops his head into his hand. Marius, but why didn't you tell me? She waits, passive in this moment, unable to. Marius, okay, just give me 30 minutes. No, I'll be there. Marius ends the call. He gets up, only in his underwear, and starts dressing haphazardly, his clothes already draped on the chair. Tembi sits up, holding the sheets over her chest to keep warm. Tembi, what's going on? Marius doesn't answer. He's trying to put on his pants. He fucks it up and nearly falls over. Tembi moves to help him, but he holds his hand to it. No, I'm fine. Tembi, what happened? Who was that? Marius sits on the end of the bed and takes a moment. Beat. Marius, it was Stefan. It's my pa. He fell. I have to go. Tembi, why would he? Oh. Marius keeps quiet, not putting on his shoes. Tembi, still unsure, knows that she needs to do something. But what? Tembi, are you okay to drive? Marius is trapped in his own personal nightmare. Tembi, Marius, no. No, really, I'm fine. Tembi moves closer. Tembi, Marius, it's your father. Marius' head dropped. He has to say it, and he hates it. That's why I'm going alone. It takes Tembi a moment. Then it hits her, and it's crushing. Tembi, okay. Yeah, you're right. Marius looks back at her, apologetic for an old man because he is a son. Marius, look, it's not really about Tembi retreats. Marius, I just don't think it would be a good idea if I came with. He stops himself. Tembi holds the sheets tighter. Marius gives up. He gets his keys and stops at the bedroom door. He turns back, ready to, but he doesn't. He leaves, she stays. She looks at the door where he had been. So, by this scene and the opening of the scene, we have something that's going to be present throughout the entire film. Tembi's black, he's white. His dad is racist. Long story short, she doesn't want him there because, he doesn't want her there because if she comes in at the end of his life and he sees that a constant reminder of how his son is failing him, it's going to make things worse. But here we have a situation where Marius has an option to take her or to leave her. Does he obey the man who raised him, but it is obviously a problem in his life? Or does he obey this relationship that he has with Tembi? Does he take her along? Does he say, forget everything, I'm going to take you with me, even though my dad's going to probably hate me on his deathbed? But he doesn't. And that's Marius's fault. And that's Marius's conflict of the entire film. He always chooses everything other than Tembi, everything other than his relationship with her. And that's the notion of it. So here we have what are actually two protagonists, but because they're coming from two sides of the same objective, they are in opposition to each other. And they're not bad people. One is not an enemy of the other, but simply because there's a phone call and there is a problem, now they are antagonists to each other when they shouldn't be. And I think the idea that I wanted to present in this, and having this as the opening scene, is that within that you understand the film and you understand the crux on the problem of the film. Everything else is informed by this dilemma. Even though it's a horror film, everything else is informed by the fact that this is the basic dilemma. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Evan.
Oh, would you mind, Thabiso, just expanding on that thing of how the theme does need to be present in every scene? Because it's actually such an important point that we didn't mention at the beginning.
Oh, right. You mean the idea that, give me 1 second, just wanted to get the, yeah. So look, some scenes are, completely disconnected to what is the emotional crux of the film. But if you can do your best to tie that scene into the emotional heartbeats of the film, then maybe that stepping away is enough of a stepping away for the audience to breathe. Because this is a very heavy scene, sure. But if you follow it up with something that's completely unrelated to the scene, maybe it's a moment for the audience to breathe, to process, and then to jump back right into the scene. I specifically tell my stories by having every scene tying into what I think is the emotional crux of the film, the theme. If as Gavin has highlighted, but a lot of screenwriters don't. A lot of screenwriters, because it's a drama comedy or something like that, they don't want every scene to be as heavy as possible. But even in that aspect, the scene that you're writing needs to stand on its own as a scene worth telling, a story worth telling within a scene. I don't know if that adds to what you were speaking of, Jan.
I'll come back to it in a sec and just play off what you said. But perhaps you can also just break it down in terms of those basic sort of questions we outlined in terms of how you crafted the scene and why it unfolded as it did.
Great. All right. So if I look at the so first of all, we have whose scene is it? If I remember, that's the first question. So whose scene is it? So really, the only reason why this is a tense scene is it's Marius. It's Marius' family that's calling him, letting him know that his dad has died. So we're taking immediately as Marius' scene. However, that being said, here's another player who is making his life complicated. Why can't he leave the room? Why can't he just get up and go to see his dad? It's because, well, Tembi's here, and what are we going to do with Tembi? So if I look at, say, for example, the beginning, these 5 questions, whose scene is it? It's Marius' scene. What does he want? He needs to go meet his dad. He needs to go find his dad on his dad's deathbed. What gets in the way? Tembi. How does he resolve it? Well, he doesn't. He bats Tembi out the way and walks out the door. I think why can be the driving conflict of any scene. But in this particular case, it's because he knows that ignoring the problem instead of dealing with it is a much easier thing to do in this moment. And in fact, that's his character flaw. He would rather ignore the problem than deal with it. And there's a tension that comes out of that. I think there was a fifth question. Sorry, guys.
Well, it was how it resolved, and then I always include why now. But let me just speak to it, because I think there's important things to highlight here. And what I was saying about the theme. So, what you're saying about having that emotional. You put it nicely. I was trying to remember your word for it, but essentially, there's a subjective journey that is running through every film, and the movement of the protagonist from a place where they have some sort of character flaw in their life to a place where they've either overcome that or basically will never do so and suffer a tragic ending, is kind of the film. And every scene really should reflect that character acting out that flaw, because that is the emotional bedrock that carries the film. So one of the other things one really wants to do in a scene and a story is putting a character to a choice. So I think Thabiso's done nicely in doing all those things here. So the flaw here of him not really being willing to put his significant other first and letting his fear, shame, the fear of other people's judgment, etc., on top is relevant here. So that simple want of he wants to go and be with his dad comes up against the obstacle of a lady who'd like to come with him, who's a significant other, but his dad would not want. So now he's faced with that choice of, do I hold true to my lady and bring her to an important moment in my life, or do I, out of shame, or not? And he does make a decision, which is the resolution, which is not, and to bad her off and to put things. But that shows us where he is. That shows us that he is this person who's not going to prioritize the person who should be important in his life. He's the person who lets his fear of his dad and the judgment, rule him. And in that sense, it both is an inciting incident, but then also at the beginning of the film, what we're always trying to do is establish world, we're trying to establish character, and we're trying to establish that alternate flaw that it forms the bedrock of what the theme of the film is. Because the theme of the film is almost always basically just a statement that says, if you've got this flaw, you must do this to get past it, or if you don't, you're going to suffer symbolic death, essentially. So the theme is the movement from the negative to the positive value of the character flaw. So Thabiso, in one nice scene, has sort of done all of those things as an opening. And so it does work as it does everything it needs to do. So in that sense, it's a well-constructed scene. So I did want to point that out.
Thanks, appreciate it. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to let you jump on.
Okay, and I'll share mine in a sec. Let me just get that up. Okay, so I recently wrote a film, and I picked a scene. There's many one could pick, but I picked this one because it was interesting to me how it came to me and how the construction worked. Because in terms of my overall story, which is a multi-plot, multi-protagonist sort of story, I needed one beat in the scene that was an important story beat that had to be in the film. But it involved one of the side characters who doesn't have much going on, and I wanted to also just give him, a little bit of time to see him, because he's important in the story, but he's not really, we don't see it from his perspective very often. This is like essentially one of two opportunities for it. And, when you construct a scene, like for me, the first thing is always kind of, okay, well, what is the scene there to do? And then the scene kind of, it gives it some sort of framework. Like I know it has to do this. But in this story, it was just this beat at the end, which basically became the resolution of the scene that had to be there. And then the rest there was room to play, but I needed to construct a story with that punchline. So it gave me direction into the scene. So I'll just read it. It's a page and a half. So it's exterior, Lenny Levy, secondhand cars, day. Lenny Levy shows a hippie, 23, a secondhand Folksy Combi. He slides open the van's back door and points into the dilapidated interior. Lenny, off the hippie's reaction. The owner was hard on it, but that's why the great price. Hippie, it needs a lot of work. Lenny, inside, but the mechanics are sound. I hate to say that, but those German swine make good cars. If you give this thing even a little care, it will keep going the rest of your life. By the way, it's a period piece in 66, and Lenny Levy is obviously Jewish, hence the German crack. Okay, Hippie, I don't know. Siren sound, faint, somewhere in the distance. Lenny, you just need to get creative. You could make it really groovy in there. You know, the dolls love these things. Hippie, it's too expensive. The sirens get louder. Lenny, I swear it's a fair price, but I promise you, if you don't pay me that, someone else will. So please don't waste my time if you're not serious. The sirens get super loud as several police cars pull into the car lot, then slam to a stop in front of Lenny and the hippie. A bunch of uniformed cops jump out the cars. Fourie and Detective Sergeant Nell get out of their own car and walk up to Lenny. Lieutenant Fourie, Leonard Levy? Lenny's voice sticks in his throat, but his horrified expression says it all. Please, come with us. Lenny looks at the hippie, panic in his eyes. Hippie, I'm going to think about it. Hippie walks away as Lenny is escorted to a car by Nell and Fourie and taken away. So the punchline was that he was arrested, and that was the beat that I needed. And he worked at a secondhand car thing, which is where he was arrested. So having the kind of what has to happen in mind and the location in mind, it suggested, something that happened at work as a prelude. And I just wanted to give him like a fun story that sort of also tells him, tells a little bit about Lenny's character. And it does tie sort of into the theme of the film, which is really about kind of disconnection from any spiritual value and kind of just being lost in a material reality. So he's just trying to sell something that would be, he's not considering this dude's well-being or if it's a good deal. He's got a van, he wants to get rid of it at as much price as he can. His obstacles, one are that our hippie friend is not entirely ignorant. But then two, that if you're going to get arrested in the mid-cell, obviously it's going to fall through. So I just thought it was fun as an introduction to bring in the sale, and then you see it's a reach, and then obviously cops running up is a nice way to kind of resolve. And so that's how that one played out.
So actually, if I may speak about it. One thing that I found to be interesting is that you actually had a situation where the protagonist, Lenny, is trying to sell a car. That's, what he's trying to do. And the hippie happens to be the object of that desire. But he completely fails at it because something else comes and takes him away. And I think that's really awesome because you have a situation where what you think is going to happen in the scene isn't what happens in the scene. And that subversion of expectations plays out really in a comedic way, which is great because it tells you the tone of the entire story. I'm guessing if the comedy does influence the rest of the story, it's not just a sticking out like in the middle of a horror film, for example.
It is basically it's a genre crime kidnapping thing. It's based on a true story in 1966 in Joburg. A group of Jewish folk, the Levy brothers, and a guy named Stan Javits is part of the Javits property family. Kidnapped a lady who was also part of the Jewish community, and her husband Bernie Glazer would be a billionaire in today's terms. And Kenny Levy wrote a book in prison that is the source material of this work. And so it's kidnapping, but they're very quirky characters. They're really an interesting bunch. And Kenny had been in a massive accident about a year before where he was in a coma afterwards for like 4 months and he was never quite right. And he's archetypally a fool. And every time Stan rocks up in his life, he gets hammered. And in this case, he goes to prison. And so in a story like that, which is it's kind of there was a very interesting political response because actually the special branch that went out after these dudes, and they assigned like 150 detectives to the case. Within 2 weeks, they caught these guys and retrieved the cash. But there was a very, it was very interesting that they got involved because obviously the special branch was more for terrorists, or whatever. Very political. And Stan was killed. Well, he committed suicide, but he was in custody. So I'm assuming because they were quite expert at suiciding people, that's what they did. but it's very unclear why he got involved. So there's this political element, and then there's these kidnappers who are really actually out of their league. And yeah, so playing with the contrast between, you know, guys who think they got a good plan and the reality of a world they didn't quite understand did allow for a lot of humor. So I had to bring it in.
And I'm guessing that because of the story itself being a very serious, a very serious set of events happening, like a Coen Brothers film, for example, having that element of comedy punching that moment, him trying to sell, funny enough, a would-be criminal or a criminal trying to sell a car to a hippie and failing at it. It's ironic, it's funny, and I think it gives that space to just divorce yourself, as an audience member, just to say, okay, here's a moment to breathe, and then going back into it, which I think is ultimately its own reward, which is why I think the scene itself, because it's something that's, not part of the main story, if that makes any sense, not following the same themes as the main story per se, or being as gritty or driven, it allows for the audience to take a moment to pause. And I think the whole idea of going from a positive to a negative, or a negative to a positive, or a negative to even worse negative, or a positive to even more big of a positive, which is what we're trying to do with our scenes. I think in this particular case, definitely allows for the story to breathe and to feel natural, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And just to speak to what you're saying also again about the themes underlying like the story as a whole, because as you're saying, it's the writer's job really to emotionally vary the experience for the audience. It's like if you go to a comedy and all you do is laugh, very quickly you'll be exhausted and there'll be no more laughter coming because you just like kind of had enough. And it's very important. There's some heavier scenes in this film, where like they're in custody and it's very challenging in isolation and so on. So it's very important to bring those moments in where the audience can go somewhere else, but it's not to change the theme. The same theme does underline in every scene, but it doesn't have to be the same emotional execution. So being able to vary the emotion while still staying true to what your story is really about and what the character is going is part of the skill. And that's where also just being able to tell slightly different stories in your scenes is such an important skill, because it's the story that in that moment will give the audience the emotional experience that they're going through. And it's really what keeps people in. So there's something that had to happen in that scene, which is the arrest, but the rest, it's like, I've got a minute and a half to really make a punchline. Can I tell a story that the audience is really going to enjoy? And if I can string through 30 odd stories like that, then it's going to be a cool film. So that's always my goal, is just, can I make the scene interesting and a good story as it stands on its own? And then slowly, if I'm consistent to my theme, then they'll all fit together nicely. And if I'm consistent to my structure, just aware, but they inform one another, the structure and the individual scene and so on. So that's really, I guess, what you're talking about earlier. Like once you start learning the craft, it's just that thing of learning my way in, and like having something. So I'm not, as I imagine a scene, having to just imagine like infinite possibilities and pick one. It's just really an awareness of the work that the scene needs to do, which then dictates the imagination of it.
Talking from that, you mentioned that when you were writing the scene, you saw, okay, I have a minute or I have a page and a half to do something with it, and you started to add that element of it being not what you expect, being the hippie trying to sell a thing. Did you find that out at the, I would say, the macro level, which is you're constructing an outline and then you're finding what scene. Did you find out at that point that this is something I needed? And you mentioned that you needed to have that beat, which is he gets arrested. Did you, once you were writing it, did you feel, no, I should add something further to this as a beat, while you're writing it? Or was it already at the outline level that you found, hey, I actually need to add a little bit of something extra for this?
Well, the process was, it's always different with every script. So in this case, this was actually like a page one rewrite. So someone had taken a bash at this, and also there's source material in terms of the book. But so there was no outline or treatment, but I had a script that I had to reimagine. but because there's also an existing material, I knew what the story was. So essentially, I already had kind of a thing. But in terms of the sequences of events, this arrest gives up Stanley Jarvitz, and then Stanley Jarvitz gives up Kenny and the other brother. So this one arrest was a domino that had to be there. But as I mentioned, we didn't really have much about Kenny, and he's always there in the background because it's the brothers, and he plays a role in the principal kidnapping. So when he rocks up, it's like if you haven't had a moment with him, then it feels a little bit weird. It's nice to have actually met the character when he interacts and when he's part of things, and to actually, like, as much as possible, I want to give every character a real role and make them real people. So because we didn't have that, I just recognized that, okay, this is a beat where we have to see him in his work alone. This is what's going to happen. And then I felt, okay, well, here's an opportunity. I can just at least give him some space, some reality. And I didn't want to give him more than a minute because I was looking already at a page count where I was trying to keep it as tight as possible. But then that's the beauty of being able to do, the draft not just in one moment, because I can go, okay, well, I'm just going to play, and maybe it was 2 pages when I started, and I get to the end, and then I go back and I start looking at my scenes, and okay, I would like to cut it, my overall count by 5 pages, and then you start tightening up the scenes, and then it'll come to its final form of just what it needs, beat by beat.
When you mention tightening the scenes, is there a criteria that you ask yourself, is this scene working? Does it need to be tightened? Maybe it needs to be removed entirely. Is it the same 5 questions that you started off, writing the scene with? Are you asking those same 5 questions again when you're looking at tightening the scene?
I am, but I guess it's an intuitive thing that happens, because really, once it's there. And then I'm just asking broadly, is this story as strong and cool as I can make it? And then, one of the golden rules I should mention of screenwriting is get in late, get out early. So I want to make sure that there's nothing superfluous in the scene. I want to make sure there's no beats that aren't needed, and I want to make sure that I've gotten in as late as possible, exited the moment, not too soon, but at the right time. And I want to check the dialogue, make sure that there's nothing also that's not needed. But really, it's just cutting it to the essence. I mean, for me, script writing is poetry, and if something doesn't need to be there, then probably shouldn't be there. I mean, occasionally, like the scene doesn't really need. I could have just put the beat. I could have. Since that sense, this isn't an essential scene, and if something were going to get cut, this would probably get cut, because the story can play without it. But I don't think it would, because it adds a nice element, and there's real purpose for why it's there. If that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it speaks to maybe the ineptitude of the character, that they will get caught in such a silly situation because they are not thinking about, hey, I need to disappear and get off the grid. And I think like, because you're putting it in that way, it speaks to character more than plot, than it would in terms of plot. And I think that's actually an essential thing. I think the balance that comes through as a writer is, do you address a scene from purely plot level, or do you give something that shows character as well? And how do you, in your own storytelling method, how do you, fight for it? Because I mean, at the end of the day, you want the scene to work, and if it isn't going to work, then you have to remove it. But if it is going to work for those 2 reasons, either it's plot or character, you have to fight for it. And that's kind of what I was dealing with in the beginning of this, of the opening scene of this film, Prime. So it was the idea that here's stasis, where you have 2 people in a bed sleeping, and that's their normal world, and that's where they're comfortable. But the worst possible thing in the world can happen, even when you're sleeping in bed, and that's to receive the news that a loved one is dying, and for that to complicate everything way more because of why that is a problem for them, is the idea of why I wrote that scene. But sometimes I'll write a scene purely because I want a character to have the moment to themselves, for us as an audience to breathe and to just sit down and see this person in the real world. And that's something that's been constructed. And I suppose that's the balance you have to have. And I think film allows for that. TV doesn't, unfortunately.
Why not?
Look, I mean, if I'm to be brutally honest, TV is a lot of plot, 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 plot. Get to the plot, get to the moment. And I feel sometimes the luxury of, paying for a ticket and sitting in a theater or sitting in a cinema, you're more tolerant to 30 seconds of no plot happening. And it's just 30 seconds of you staring at a character. I mean, thinking of 12 Years a Slave, if anyone in the audience anyone who's participating has seen that film, there's a moment where the main character is hung. He's not killed, he's just hung. And 5 minutes of nothing happens. And really, if it was a TV show, you've already got the remote in your hand, and you're really like, okay, I'll change the channel. Unless you're super invested in the story, unless the story is doing something for you. But I feel that film, if you've given enough, if you've really rewarded, say, for example, the film and the audience with enough, I think you can get away with things like that. I think the audience is more than happy to say, okay, let's have a moment to breathe as well. But that's my personal thing. I think, Kevin, maybe you can answer as to why I don't think that could happen in TV.
Well, I think it's a little bit, again, it's one of those things that is, again, kind of down to technique. And yes, as the challenge, you do have slightly kind of more give from the audience in film, but also not so much anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it's always about doing both. Plot and character are so intimately tied together. In your opening, even though it's not a very fast one, the plot's moving and the characters being revealed, and it's always, as someone tries to get something, we get to see who they are, and it's by them taking action or not taking action that we get to see who they are. So the plot is always calling forth character, and I think more what you're talking about is pacing. And there are shows now more and more that on TV that are allowing a slow pace. I don't know if you've seen American Gods, or even Westworld,
Yeah.
but American Gods does it beautifully. Like they really let the things breathe. And something also, I think the first time it really was hit home to me was by reading Sidney Lumet. But he put it very nicely, was that, sometimes slow is fast, because, if it's paced well and the pacing, it keeps the audience with you, then it feels like time's moving. And, you can, sometimes that 2.5 hour movie can just pass like you didn't even realize. Whereas sometimes that 90-minute movie where every scene is just like, it's kind of like, again, it just feels like eternity, because it just, didn't keep you, and it was maybe trying to do too much too quickly, and then it all kind of feels like, yeah. So I think, pacing's a real thing. But it's time to open up this discussion. So let's do that. I actually just really need a pee, so I'm just going to let Tabiso host this a little bit. I'll be right back.
Okay, great. Actually, this is a perfect opportunity to jump into participation with everyone else who's part of the chat. Thank you for joining, by the way. We really appreciate it. It's great to engage with other people. So before I speak to what Nelson's asking over here, I think what Gavin was mentioning is, is it Savria? You can talk if you want as well. You can quickly chime up. We're more
Hello, it's Savira. It rhymes with Bagheera.
Okay, Savira, nice to meet you.
And gone again. And you.
So what Gavin was talking about, I think, is from Sidney Lumet's Making Movies. It's a very useful book in terms of storytelling. Of course, it's Sidney Lumet, the very famous writer, director, actor, who's talking about his entire experiences as a filmmaker and how it is working with actors. And really, it's his memoirs, but he's talking about filmmaking. He's talking about storytelling and craft. And I recommend that everyone reads it, irrespective if you're a director, a writer, or an actor. There's always something to be had in that. So just talking quickly as to, Nelson's question of it. And I agree with you. I think that definitely if it's non-serialized TV, so if it's overarching story that has been told over multiple episodes, which is mostly what SVODs are doing these days, which is Netflix, Amazon Prime, even Showmax, because they know that they have you in the chair. They know that you're going to be binging it the whole way through, especially. They're going to be telling an overarching story. And that's something that I think is the evolution of TV. HBO started it all the way back then with The Sopranos. Then they did it again with The Wire. Then they did it with Oz. And they were doing that. They were telling overarching stories. And that's where the idea came through that maybe TV could be a long form film. And I agree with you 100%. But the majority of TV is serialized. The majority of easy content, if that makes any sense. What you're going to tune in every week for to get your fix is the serialized, hey, this episode is this. There's going to be a plot point that's discussed, your Law and Orders, your anything telenovela. So the overarching story, it's very difficult to keep an audience member tied through an entire season to one story. But it is easy for them to give them that fix for that week. And then maybe in the background tell an overarching story. There's a great show called Fringe. It used to be on Fringe and X-Files. They actually did the same thing, where they would have an overarching story, but every episode would be serialized and then punched with the overarching story. So, isn't film just a single episode of more production? I agree with you, Marvel's probably got the best. Kevin Feige will say yes to you without a doubt. But if you've seen any of the series, WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and now Loki, those series don't work on normal TV. They work because you've built up the relationship to the characters through these movies, if you have, and you're more than willing to week by week engage with this character. But the story itself, if it was a single own story that's told in NBC or on SABC or whatever, you would have given up by now, because the overarching story that's present in every episode might not sustain you to the next week. You would want to watch it all in one bite. And maybe that's where SVODs are winning because of that. If you can binge the whole thing, you're going to binge it. I don't know, Nelson, is that sort of answering your question?
Sorry, can you hear me? All good?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. Considering our history of TV, where in syndication, you never could see the same episode after each other. So therefore, everything would have been out of order. Hence why traditionally TV episodes were actually created on their own, with their own little story, with like a hint of what happened before, after to evolve. But now, as you say, and it even went even before the current ones that we're enjoying, like for instance, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, that sort of thing. And that's just the popular ones. I mean, at the end of the day, we're now evolving that the entire TV industry is becoming a very much overarching. It starts at the first episode and ends at the last episode of that season. So that's why also I was agreeing with what's the difference between TV and film. Film for me is just simply more production, more condensed, more concentrated, to actually create one full-length massive story that people can then really enjoy and then complete. With TV, it's just longer, and we basically are now being force-fed this beautiful lovely storytelling.
So I'm going to actually add something to it. So TV, I mean, especially now, thanks to HBO, TV is the writer's domain. I think everyone knows that. So I think it's now, it's an opportunity for you to tell a massive story over many episodes. That's why Game of Thrones, up until a certain point, worked really well. It's the whole idea that you can take the time. You can take the time. But what I'm specifically speaking to is having a scene where nothing happens. And when I say nothing, I mean like nothing plot significance happens. So even if we're talking about TV, I look at, say, for example, The Wire. Now, The Wire, even when something that looks like nothing happens, it's actually there for a plot point. It's actually there to express an idea that's going to become super relevant in the next scene, where something big happens. So if I look at, for example, film, on the other hand, film, if you go to the works of the old artists, the old filmmakers, the old French guys and so forth. Jean-Luc Godard is probably the best example. There's an idea in film that you can have a scene, then another scene, and you don't have to show what happened in between the scenes. The audience is already smart enough to figure out, hey, something happened. I don't need to see that he stole a car and then he got caught. I don't need to see the journey to where he got caught. He just got caught. And that's called an ellipsis. Now, an ellipsis works in film, but it doesn't work in TV, because when you're engaging with story on that level, where you're, working with the whole story, an ellipsis is too jarring to get over. You're simply left with a problem. And Game of Thrones actually is the perfect example for that, where you had seasons 1 to 4 as being these beautifully constructed. You see every moment unfolding. You understand the motivations for the characters and so forth. The last season, you had a character who you'd been rooting for the whole time suddenly turn into a monster. And it's because there's so much missing in between that development, the initial point of that character and then the final point, that it's so jarring to watch. But had it been a self-contained film, maybe you would have gotten away with it. Anyway, that's that's what I got to say about that. I don't know, Gavin, if you have something to add to that. We were just talking to Nelson's point about TV's evolved, where a season is basically a long movie cut up into 8 to 12 parts, and especially now, isn't film just an episode, a longer episode? I mean, the Marvel films, isn't that just one episode in the 22 episode season that is the Marvel Avengers universe?
Yeah, I saw the question. I don't know if I have much to add. I think you discussed it quite nicely. I think for me, it does really depend show to show. And I think the lines are much more blurred than they used to be. And yeah, it's interesting what's happening now, but I think, story, and obviously the medium does bring in its own constraints and its own opportunities. It's just, I think it's just a great time to be alive to watch, where it's going. I think we're definitely moving in better directions across the board. So I'm curious.
Okay, so today we actually have quite a few people that we've not seen before, and I'm actually wondering. I mean, because we have time to engage with everyone, but I'd like to open the floor up to anyone who wants to ask a question about scene. Maybe there's someone who's struggling with the idea of creating scenes that feel natural or that do work, because I think that's actually the thing that we're all trying to figure out as writers. All the scenes that we're writing, do they do the work of telling the story? And I'm going to actually open up to anyone who wants to ask a question, even if it's just a personal question. Maybe they want to know something, or they can have something that adds to it.
I would love to ask a question and also make a comment. Kevin mentioned something regarding being original and also finding your voice. I think he said something along those lines when you write your dialogue. Because mostly I struggle with that, because my scripts or scenes and dialogue, I always want to make sure that it doesn't sound the same. And whenever I go back and read the scenes, I'm like, I've heard this 1,000 times, and how can I make it unique? And also sometimes it's a matter of background and tradition also, because I've realized the more I write about different cultures and different characters, the language itself changes. So how do you stay true to the dialogue and not try to sound like anybody else? Because sometimes the problem is hearing the dialogue and you in your head, you're like, how can I change this? Because I've heard it 1,000 times. And how can I stay true to writing for a different background? Because at some point, you need to be true to the language itself. So I have to put myself in the shoes of a Zulu person. I also have to put myself in the shoe of a Xhosa guy. I have to put myself in the shoe of a Tswana guy, or English guy, or Afrikaner guy, so that I can stay true to the language. And I've been struggling with that for quite some time. But I think at some point, as I learn different languages, I get to understand them. How do I make sure even the language itself, the translation of the dialogue, is true to the character? Because sometimes you'll write something in English, and then when it has to be translated, it's a completely different thing from a certain language, from a different culture. So my question is, how do you make sure that you stay true to different characters in terms of the language? And also, as far as I'm hearing the conversation, and you guys are mostly referencing shows outside of the country. And I've consumed a lot of content outside, because America is, when it comes to writing and everything else, they are up there. So I understand why, because at some point we have to reference something. But I would love, because when you guys were reading your scripts, I felt like I was connecting with it. It felt so South African to me in terms of how you wrote your scene, how the guys were relating to each other, even the language between this guy talking about the German cars, even the girl with is it Mark, I think. So I felt more connected to them, because when I read American scripts, the language tends to differ. So how do we stay true to that? And which other shows we can reference in terms of South Africa, other than the American shows you have mentioned so far?
Well, from my side, it's I mean, there's a lot in your questions, so let me kind of work my way backwards. Um, it's unfortunate that I don't know many shows that make a good reference locally because I don't watch many, to be honest, and I unfortunately don't watch many Southern films. But on the other hand, I don't watch many films. Period. I used to, and now I just find myself very impatient with most films and not willing to slug through the ones that suck to find the ones that are good. Much easier with a series because once you get into it, you've got lots of viewing time, and I think some of the best writing is happening in series now. As far as the language goes, that is probably the greatest challenge I think that any writer has, and the great thing about the American shows is the resources that they have available to them. And these aren't individual writers that are creating these things, but teams. So one of my favorite shows is Billions, and that's deals with like a hedge fund billionaire and an attorney general. And every time they write that show, they sit there in a room with a hedge fund billionaire and a sitting attorney general so that they can get it right. And we kind of do need to do the same. So I'll speak a little bit more about the dialogue in a second. But for me, it's really impossible to know exactly what another person's world's like. So when I finish a script and before I'm going to submit it to someone, I do try and rope in friends who know better the characters and the worlds that I'm writing. So if I'm going to write a colored character, I'm going to find a colored friend and just say, look, how close is this language, and is there mannerisms or something that I should tweak, how would a dude from, your world actually say this? Because I'm always kind of projecting myself into the character and doing my best, but, I'm not a woman, for instance, and there's going to be, if it's a female protagonist going through the scene, there's just going to be aspects of the experience that because I haven't walked through the world like that I wouldn't know exactly this is maybe how I should speak or not. And I can do a fairly good job. Like, my female characters are good. My characters aren't far, but I have to check it. I feel absolutely I have to run it with someone, who actually would check that actual language to make sure that there's not something that just in my ignorance that I'm missing. But on the other hand, one can get close because one will run through the scene in terms of the archetypes that are at play. So if you look at my scene, I'm looking at someone who's doing the job of selling. So I've got a salesman, whether that's a Jewish salesman or whether it's an Indian salesman or whether it's an Afrikaans salesman or a guy or a girl, they've got a job to do. So some of the language will just be dictated by what they're there in that scene to do. So they're going to have to sell that combi, and they're going to have to say, oh, this is great and this is whatever. How they particularly choose to do it is where the originality can come in. And then, it's kind of what kind of, is this an ethical salesman or is this someone who's not? And if so, then they're going to approach it slightly differently. And, is this an experienced salesman or is this a not experienced salesman? And then it'll be slightly different. So I'm always calibrating according to who that character is, but then particularly by the archetype, the role they're playing. And that'll help me get close because whoever it is, they'll all be, going after that objective in a similar way. And it's the same then, I'm trying to, it becomes original, I think, by being specific. The more specific you can be about who that character is and how they would approach that task, the more original it will be. It really is in the specificity. So people often generalize and it's just like a kind of a broadsheet character, you don't feel it. But the more you can actually know who that character is, the more original it will come across. So also when I go through a script, I will very in depth think through every single character's biography, because the more I do that and the more I know who they are in their own worlds, then the more alive they become as they interact. So often, like also if I get to the end of a script and I've thought it through from the protagonist's point of view, I will go back and every other major character, I will imagine the story from their perspective, where they were before they arrived in a scene, where they will be afterwards, what sort of mood they were in, etc. And the more detailed I can be, then the more it comes alive. That's kind of the way I understand it. But then it is great to be able to check it.
Okay, Zuko, I'm actually going to speak to you about a couple of things, but I'm going to start off with where Gavin started off, and that's South African content. So I do watch a lot of South African content. I try to engage with it as much as possible. The reason why is not to find what is the best South African content out there that I can closely attach myself, but just to engage with content, with films, with shows, with the whole idea that, hey, where are we going right, where are we going wrong, you know? So I've been watching a lot of Showmax recently, a lot of Showmax shows. I watch a couple of telenovelas, mainly because a lot of the actors that I work with are on those shows. So I'll watch it because of that. So I've seen Damn, if I remember correctly. I saw all the Netflix original shows and everything. And I tried to watch some Mzansi Magic films. So I think if you are looking for examples of shows that are like, the gold star standard for you as an aspirational goal to meet, right? I think don't try look at local content for that specific purpose. I think local content is a great place to start learning, to start engaging with, what is common stories that are being told on this platform, on that platform. Why do I find it exciting? Why do I find it interesting? But the second you start looking for, standards of excellence, you're going to find more and more problems in those shows, and you're going to disengage with those shows as a result. So if I have to recommend anything, if you really want to, to go down this rabbit hole of watching things, watch Mzansi Magic. Watch as much of it as humanly possible. Watch as many of the films, even if they're bad, even if they're good, watch all of them. And then decide for yourself, what did I like from them? What didn't I like? Put it down on a list. And then that informs more and more of your taste, your sensibilities. So for me specifically, I actually don't like the majority of American stuff. I think it's garbage. I think it's a lot of it is manufactured content for an audience that buys materialistic things. They don't tell a lot of good stories. But that's because my taste sensibilities are, I want to engage with stories that speak to heart. So I watch a lot of Mexican films. I watch a lot of Korean and Japanese and Chinese and European stuff. And for some reason, when I do that, I start to look more at South African content and I start enjoying it more because I start to see what is the common stories, because everyone's trying to make films and TV and everything in South Africa, but we have structural problems in the way we tell our stories, which, you're going to tell the next great South African story, I believe personally. But so if you want to engage with South African content, watch all of it and see what sticks. Maybe you like Afrikaans content. Maybe you like Afrikaans films, but we are not the purveyors of that. We're not the gatekeepers for you and that content. And that's my small point about that. So look, the language of the work. So what we're writing, you must remember that because we're presenting it as South Africans, our scripts, it does come off as being South African. You're hearing a South African voice. You're hearing a South African reading it. So that actually speaks to something that's really important. You're worried about if your dialogue sounds real or not, right? So how much of that is actually the actor who is performing the piece? Remember that the actors, if they're good actors, are going to do a lot of work to try to figure out the character, to try to figure out the way they speak, the mannerisms, the idiosyncrasies. And the director is going to work with them to make it sound authentic. So I know I'm going to get shot by everyone in this group because I'm speaking from the point of view as a writer-director. But I would say, if your thing is to make it as realistic as possible, recognize that you're only going to get to a certain point for that until you have to start giving it to other people to make it sound more real. You know what I mean? So if you're going to be writing about an Afrikaans guy, write it down. Remember, the dialogue is in service to story. Dialogue is in service to character, the unveiling of character. So maybe it doesn't sound 100% like what you think an Afrikaans person is going to sound like, or what you think a Zulu girl is going to sound like. But because you're expressing story, because you're expressing the plot or the character, you can leave it up to the actor to make it sound, to have that twang or to have that thing, So you shouldn't. I think someone put it down over here. The job of the screenwriter is to stress about whether it looks good or not, right? So recognize that there's a point where you have to hand it over to the actor. You have to hand it over to the director if you're not directing your own work. So as long as you know that the dialogue is a function of the story and the character, especially within the scene, then it's going to work. It's going to feel good, even if you've heard it a million times over, like you've heard that joke in every other movie. But it's going to sound different in your movie, because in your movie, many other things are happening around that line of dialogue that give it something way more, something that is much more significant than just that perfect sentence. I don't know if I'm answering that point that well, but so dialogue can be realistic or can be stylized. I wouldn't worry too much about it being super realistic. I would say make sure the scene works, make sure the dialogue is speaking to what's happening in the moment, speaking to the characters, and one way or another, it's going to be felt on set. It may even be entirely scrapped, to be honest. It depends on the actor and the dialogue and then the director, but work with that, figure that thing out. So I actually want to speak to you about something. Dialogue is not real talk. If you listen to people really talk to each other, it's the most boring thing in the world. And you should try it. You should actually sit down at a restaurant or do it. It's what writers do. We are voyeurs. We sit down and we listen to other people and other people's stories. If you go to the restaurant and you start listening to other people's conversations, most of it is pretty boring. But you'll find within those conversations, there's a hell of a line that's said or a hell of a story that's said. Your job as a screenwriter is to filter out all of the other stuff and tell that story, to give that zinger of a line, to give that moment, because that's what the audience wants. They know real life. They know that most of real life is actually boring, but there's something that happens and suddenly your attention is there. So in terms of it sounding super realistic, you'll rewrite it in production itself. Believe me on that. Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Are we making sense to you? Do you feel a bit better? If we've helped you feel better, that's what counts.
Now, it made a lot of sense, guys. I got some key points there, which are kind of fresh. So yeah, you helped me a lot.
I wanted to speak a bit more about that because, Luzuko, if I remember correctly, you are a training line producer, and then you want to become a screenwriter as well. So I know a lot of people in this conversation, even though we don't have that much time left, a lot of people are actually not professional screenwriters. There are people who are interested in the idea of telling stories, but maybe don't have the craft just yet. So I would say if you are having a problem with dialogue, see whether or not the scene is the problem at first. See whether or not the tension, the conflict in the scene is clear, or maybe you wanted to make it not so clear, but see whether or not that's working first. And then see if the dialogue is speaking to that, if the dialogue is speaking to characters. And then after that, if it's still not working, have it read out, listen to it, listen to other people saying it. I think that's the ways in which you can address it, especially if you're not a professional screenwriter and you're doing this for the first time. These are some of the tools you need to engage with. So I'm just going to speak to some of the questions that have come up over here and some of the comments. So Albert just says, hi, you had to run. That's great. Thanks, Albert, for coming through. Savira, so you have hard to imagine oneself into a character of different culture and race. Absolutely. That's the research you have to do. That's the time it takes in order for you to figure out maybe your idea of who that person is, and then do the most you can with it. And then, leave it up to the actors to have the space to play with it, if that makes any sense. Dialogue, Facebook friends, etc. And yeah, actors are really important. They're the window into the story for the audience. The story comes through the eyes of the actor, and let's treat them with the respect they deserve. They do the grunt work of lifting our page onto the screen. If that works. Yes. So I'm just going to leave it open for Gavin to address any more questions and to have any more final comments.
Well, I was just looking at Fisher's question, and it's an important one because Tabiso and I were very much wanting to make, especially the second half of these calls, completely open for anyone to ask anything. So it doesn't have to relate to the discussion, the topic of the day. It's just we're here and we're a group of writers, and anything you want to bring up is cool. So unfortunately, the guild is basically terming this an outside sort of call. So they will allow, they're going to give a call normally on a Tuesday. They forgot yesterday. But we will, on the Telegram group, give lots of notice that the calls are coming up. And then, yeah, just come along with your questions, and we are here to answer them. And maybe other people in the group will also have answers, not just us. Fisher? Sorry, did you want to?
Okay, I was saying thank you for the opportunity, and yeah, like I would just say maybe next time we can just get to maybe like send us some personal emails, because emails from the guild, they keep coming, especially for me. I can get 5 from them a day, so I can do them all. Like, so yeah, for this one I think I just saw it and I was like, let me try to I cannot gamble to get chance. I was like, yeah. So next time if I can just maybe like try to get a reminder or like something like straight into my email, like about it. I mean, yeah, I think maybe it can, but like I think I dropped my email, so please, yeah, next time we can just maybe like give us like entities like prior, so we can prepare anything. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, we
Okay,
can
thanks,
depend
Fisher.
on from you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, cool. I'm actually going to speak to that as well as Nelson's question. So the Writers Guild has a Telegram group. Telegram, of course, is the app on your phone, the messaging app. So I think you just have to email them and they'll give you the invites, right? So just email the admin at the Writers Guild group. I think if we can, ask them to send another round of emails that speak to the Telegram group and how you can join it. But I think if you are all part of that Telegram group, it makes the notification of these sessions much easier. So to give an understanding of how we're doing this, we're basically trying to do this every fortnight. Every 2 weeks, we're going to meet together on a Wednesday or whenever it works out for best for everyone. But we're going to have at the same time, and we're going to be doing with different stages of writing, different level of craft, and of course, bringing your own questions and everything. So we will get the Writers Guild to spread the message that there is a Telegram group, and it's good for everyone to be part of it because there's a lot of information that gets sent on it as well. So Fisher, I hope that we can get you onto that. And as well as, yes, we know the emails are there, but emails are not necessarily the most immediate thing, especially if your email is full of other things and you're trying to ignore the notifications. You might miss the call for this. Sorry, Gavin, you want to add to that? Or?
No, I think again you covered it, but maybe we should consider building a mailing list if people do want that. But
okay, cool.
It's quite happy at Telegram.
I see that Moniseni wants to ask a question. Hey, how are you doing, by the way?
Hey, no, I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine, Chris and Kevin. No, I've just, I'm not sure. I'll just like you to comment on this one because that is what I tend to use a lot in a scene. I, first of all, do not concern myself as to what type of dialogue I will be using there. So the first thing that I would say, okay, what type of a scene is this? Okay, who will be involved? Now, what is the emotional state of my characters in this scene? Then I spend time imagining how the characters will behave in this emotional state in this particular scene. So I spend a lot of time just like feeding my subconscious mind. Now, when I start writing out the scene, what is paramount in my mind is the emotional state of the characters in that particular scene. Then I usually find that the dialogue just flows out because I know that the dialogue of the protagonist should be unique and surprising. So I use a lot of the subconscious. I do not worry myself about what this character is going to say, but I used to say, okay, what is the emotional state of my protagonist here? What is the emotional state of my antagonist in this scene? Then I go into that, and then the dialogue just flows out. And then at the end of the day, I find that I've surprised myself with the kind of the dialogue that I've used. I'm not sure if that is the correct approach to first look at or consider or spend much of your imagination as to what is the emotional state of the characters in that particular scene. I'm not sure if you can comment on that one.
For me, I think it's obviously very important to consider the emotional state, and obviously it will dictate a lot of how the behavior unfolds. I think ultimately for me, it's such an intuitive process that I kind of feel into it and then sort of go from there. But it's a thing of having crafted enough that at this point, I don't really think about it consciously. I just kind of feel like, okay, it's just something like an intuitive thing that happens. And probably, if anything, I am driven by the objective of the protagonist, but all these things are lurking in my subconscious and all are influencing as I write. So you definitely, the emotional state of the characters absolutely is very critical. And then, just who they are, what they all want, where they're going, just there's so many levels that are kind of in the pot. And then what comes out comes out. But if it's one thing for me, it is the driving of the what each character wants that helps me through. But I think it's such a personal. It's a completely personal approach. I think everyone needs to just have their own thing, and just from doing it enough, you'll find what works for you. So it sounds like that works very well for you. So that's I guess what one wants to be so.
Yeah, I will say that if that works for you, and if it gives you what you need to make the scene work and do the work of the storytelling, then that's your process. I think that one thing that I want everyone in this group to understand is process, your way of making that thing work is yours. And if that produces the best possible scene for you and what you need for that story, you should work with it. There is no one right way. I don't believe that specifically in storytelling. I think that if you find that works for you, coming from the emotional state point instead of from the plot point, that's great. But if you can in your own way do the work to make both of them happen at the same time, you might find that the storytelling becomes much, much more poignant. And I think maybe that's a task that I will ask you to think about for a while. But there is no correct way. I think there's no one right way.
Okay, thanks, guys. Sure.
I guess we have time for maybe one last question. Does anyone have one that they would like to put to the group? Okay, if not, I'll just say, Savara, if people are keen for a mailing list, then it seems worth doing. And you do have a question there. Maybe Thabiso wants to pick this one up because as a director is probably better placed to answer that
one. Can anyone recommend where I can learn about the role of camera angles, etc.? There is, in fact, there are, and storyboarding, you're rather green. So I think, okay, can you give me your email address? Just put your email address quickly over there. There's too much information out there about it. There's a lot of text, a lot of YouTube videos and everything. A great place I think would be to start is Studio Binder. Studio Binder has a YouTube account where they go into detail as to what camera angles and so forth. What do they mean story-wise? Not just the practical sides of it, but actually what does lighting mean? What do all these things mean? So if you want to include that as part of your screenwriting, sure, I think it's okay if you are perhaps the one who's directing it. Generally, if you are just the screenwriter on the film, I would say focus almost entirely on getting story right, character right, and everything. If you feel there's an absolute angle that needs to happen, sure, you can put it in. Just don't be heartbroken when they don't choose that for production. That's all I have to say. But if you are and not just a storyboarding, but it's your own project, then it's perfect. So great. So I'm gonna see if I can send some stuff to you. So this is, like I said, Studio Binder is a great learning resource. Their YouTube channel is perfect for finding out more about craft. So it's a good starting point, but recognize that majority of all learning experiences come from you doing it yourself, especially in this in making something happen for the screen. So I've taken down your email. Looks like a couple of people want this information, but yes, Studio Binder, one word, on YouTube, a great place to start for that. And I will send you some. I'll send you some stuff.
Okay, so that's kind of time for today. And as Thabiso said, about 2 weeks from now, we will have the next one. We'll figure out the date and then we'll put it on the WhatsApp group. I mean, the Telegram group. And potentially we will start a mailing list as well and keep you in touch in that way. So if you do also, if anyone here does want a mail, just put your email address in now and we can at least start compiling a list of who wants notifications.
I think Hulisani has asked the question, how I'd like to ask about bringing USA content into SA. I think that's more of a distribution question. I think really it's something that if you really want to do that, that's great. Speak to the major distributors in South Africa, AAA, I know Helen at Indigenous, they deal a lot with that. I don't know if you want to become your own distributor, if that's what you're actually asking. It is a bigger question. It's not screenwriting really, but if you want to do that, that's perfect. Just know that there are big players right now doing that. And I think if you can find out about those players and what they do, you might answer some of the questions that you may have. I don't know if that's the question you were asking for. You want to say something, Hulisani?
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask more about like bringing them USA content here at South Africa, because I wrote a series which is called The Game of Chess and Dice, which I'd like to be more like what can I say? I like it to be like prison breaks and all that. So I'd like to ask about materials. I'd like to ask something like that.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you want to take a concept that has been used for an American show and then make it work for South African context.
No, like the series that I'm talking about that I've written, which is called Chess and Dice, or The Game of Chess and Dice, is about sort of university life, or like it's my own. I'm just bringing the content. So I like to ask about, because I basically wanted to be more of like prison break, like money heist, because it's gonna be like that, because like there's more of gangsters, there's more of like such things. So I'd like to ask about like materials, such things. Thank you.
Okay,
Just,
I think, sorry, Gavin.
Am I right in hearing, sorry, because we just, maybe it's hard to understand how you're tying that to the American question. So are you saying basically that you'd like American producers for your show, or to do it on a sort of international scale and it's aimed elsewhere? Is that what you have in mind? Or Thabiso, did you get that?
Yeah, I think what Hulisani is asking is, she has an idea for a show. She wants to develop it further, and she wants to bring in different themes and so forth. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. You have to develop it. That's the reality of it. How you develop it is you follow the development process, which is finding characters, finding interesting stories within that context of it being a university thing. Find someone who you think is the story. The story should be told through, and that's a protagonist. Who do you want to be in that world? Tell the story to that. Find different elements to it. It's not. I can't give you. It's a discussion that needs to be had over a development period. It's not something that we can answer you directly. If I'm understanding, that's what you're asking. How do I develop this series, this story?
Say?
Okay, look, we'll take it at that as that being the case. But maybe how about this? The next 2 weeks we'll be meeting again. How about you take a crack at finding out a main character in the show? Put it down, try figure out an interesting story within that context, and then bring it to us next week, or bring us in 2 weeks' time, and then we can talk about it. Talk about it not too much that you give away the entire thing, but maybe you have questions that come up about you creating that main character and the storyline. And if you want to bring that up as something that you want to talk about in the next session, then Gavin and I will do what we can. I think, to help you with that. I don't know, Gavin, does it sound like a reasonable proposition?
Sure. Yes. And if I can just answer Faith, I do not know a good 101 class. I know that the Guild is developing some. Tabiso, do you know if Faith's looking for a script writing 101 class?
Yeah, script writing 101. I would say read scripts and then write scripts, but I think the most important thing for you to do is watch content. Watch as much stuff as possible. Watch it with a notebook. See what you can identify as elements in the stuff that you're watching. If you're a producer, you've read a lot of scripts. So read a lot more and read them and try to figure out why you like some scripts over other scripts. What about the dialogue works? What did you like about the character? List those things. Start breaking them down along those lines. What do you like? What don't you like? Then start reading books about script writing. Start engaging with YouTube channels and things that talk about that. But I think more importantly, if you want to be a screenwriter, if you want to learn how to write a script, most important thing is to first figure out your own voice. And then you can learn the mechanics of screenwriting, the mechanics of storytelling, and so forth. So I would engage a lot with what you like and try and needle it out and try to figure out what do you like, what don't you like, and then give yourself reasons for it. Once again, if you wanted to know the more nitty-gritty, the more craft-related things, Studio Binder, great place to start.
Yeah, there's also I've never tried them, so I can't really recommend them per personal experience. But there's the Masterclass brand, and they've got they've got script writing courses from like Aaron Sorkin and some other like quite heavyweight names. So if you look for Masterclass screenwriting, if you Google it, you should find some interesting things. There's also a local named Matthew Khalil who wrote a book, The 5 Wells of Screenwriting, and he offers an online kind of workshop introduction course. And you could get his name from the contact details from the Guild, Matthew Khalil. And if you get in touch with him, he might be able to, either he's running the course still, or he'd be able to probably point you in a direction for what you need.
Okay, so Hulisani, I'm just going to ask you to stop sharing the screen. There's a specific reason why. Yeah, so it's mainly because you're literally putting your idea out for everyone to see. So I don't want you to do that. Remember, you have to keep your ideas copyrighted to yourself and everything like that, the whole thing. Look, I think if you want to know more about this avenue of screenwriting and so forth, there is a lot of stuff you have to do. I just saw you had an outline. In fact, I think what I'm going to say right now is that everyone who needs to go now, thank you very much for coming through and spending time with us. And we're definitely going to do this again in a fortnight's time or so. And we will ensure that everyone is informed beforehand, either through the Telegram group, or we'll try to see if we can get the Writers Guild to send an email beforehand. But we've taken down the email addresses here. We've taken down notes from who wants to be involved in, further information and so forth. So we will definitely get in contact with you guys. But do know that in 2 weeks' time, we are going to be definitely, making something like this happen again. So please have a lot of questions ready, and we'll be looking forward to engaging with you. Kevin?
Yeah, no, that's good for me. So yeah, thank you all for joining us, and have an awesome couple of weeks, and we'll see you guys soon.
Great. Okay, so Hulisani, I think where you are right now is you have an idea and you want to make it into a story. I'm going to tell you that you perhaps do need to sit down with a person who writes, who is a screenwriter of some kind, or maybe even a director or something, and sit down with your idea and figure out whether or not it's actually a story just yet. You may have what we like to call the world of a story, which is a setting, but you may not necessarily have a story that you can tell just yet. So I would recommend sitting down with someone that you know, or someone you can get hold of, and who has the time to spend maybe 2 to 3 hours with you, maybe buy them lunch or something, buy them a coffee, and try to hash out whether or not what you've got is a story. I think by showing us what you've shown us right now, it does seem a lot more like it's a setting, not actually a story.
Okay, I'm going to end this. I need to get going. So again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Thabisa for steering it with me. And thank
No
you
problem.
for coming.
Yeah. It's always a pleasure. Everyone who's here,
Cheers,
thank you
cheers,
very
cheers,
much.
guys.
Cheers,
Cheers, cheers.
We'll see you guys in 2 weeks' time.
Bye from me too.
No, Maranjan. Great.